Yeah, John, thanks very much for that really generous introduction. And since you've got a little free time on your hand, maybe we can talk later about, you can be my publicist, or you could be my, I don't know what, you could write my books. We can work something out.
Time now, I'm retired.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean. So thanks to President Franklin and Professor Borda, and thanks to Victoria, too, for doing all the work to, I guess, to get me here. And it's been a nice time so far. I've learned a lot about your university and your exciting program in cultural studies with it sounds like a fairly heavy emphasis on media, which is pretty exciting for me. So I'm happy to be here. I'm excited to be here and excited to share with you some work that, that is really, really new for me. And I want to say a little bit about just give a little context for the talk tonight. I think it belongs to what I'm thinking of as a project that comes after my project Feed Forward, which we'll discuss tomorrow. And it's a project tentatively titled Logics of the Future, and I'm interested in looking at some case studies, among other things, looking at some case studies of what I'm calling logics of the future that range from what I'm going to talk about tonight in the final section of my talk, financial derivatives, which have a futurity that is just in the very immediate future, to something like global warming, which has a much longer range futurity, and to think about well, in some ways, I guess it's to think about the way the future is implicated in the present. And this makes me think that, in a way, I'm to use Whitehead's terminology, who's the philosopher that I'm thinking about these days, thinking these issues through. I'm happy to be the very first superject of John Fekete, coming here and bringing you, new stuff that is carrying on his wake. So this is a great opportunity. My paper takes place in 9 sections, and I'll have some slides just to keep you from getting too bored, and sometimes to deliver content I don't have time to deliver in my reading of my talk. I think it lasts about 45 to 50 minutes. So let me begin. In Process and Reality, philosopher Alfred North Whitehead defines the genre of philosophy he is engaged in, namely speculative philosophy, as the, quote, attempt to form a system of general ideas that is necessary, logical, coherent, and in function of which the elements of our experience can be interpreted. Okay, and Whitehead, for those of you that have never heard of him, is a philosopher who had a number of phases in his career. He's probably best known as the co-author of the Principia Mathematica, that great project to formalize symbolic logic, right, to give a foundation for mathematics with Bertrand Russell, and they were published, 3 of the 4 volumes were published in the teens. He then went on to become a speculative philosopher who, as I understand him, had as his mission to develop an account, a metaphysical account of the structure of reality that did 2 things, that explained why experience was like it was, and that did justice to the latest findings in science, right? And that means relativity, Einstein's relativity, and even more relevantly and pressingly for him writing in the mid to late 20s, the new discoveries that were happening in quantum mechanics. Okay? So this is a philosopher who, in my work now, I'm arguing is a very useful resource for us thinking about exactly that dimension that John Fekete, put his finger on in a really great way about my work, namely all of the operations of computation that are happening beneath the threshold of perception outside of our awareness that nonetheless have a lot to do with our sensory experience and, as you say, are our best friend, right? I really like that. Okay, so back to my talk. By calling his philosophy speculative, Whitehead seeks to specify a certain relationship between this system of general ideas, which is, again, necessary, logical, and coherent, and the contingency of actual experience, whose explication it is designed to facilitate. Rather than forming a transcendental ground for experience, a ground that comes first and forms the condition of possibility for experience, the necessary, logical, and coherent speculative system is first and foremost a device that allows us to interpret our experience. But the speculative system, as we shall see, is also, and in fact most fundamentally, itself a perspective on experience that is, in certain crucial respects, divergent from what is given in experience. Let me begin my talk by emphasizing the importance of keeping these two elements, speculative system of ideas on the one hand, actual experience on the other, separate, but paradoxically of keeping them separate in order precisely to be able to determine, appreciate, and benefit from their deep correlation, and indeed, what I shall claim is their ontological oneness. This need to keep separate and yet correlate is particularly evident in relation to what is perhaps the core of Whitehead's method of speculation, the domain of mathematics. In my talk, I shall take a distance from debates about the continuity of Whitehead's career, from his early work in mathematics that culminated again in the publication of some volumes of the Principia Mathematica, to his final philosophical phase, marked by the speculative project of process and reality. So I will not focus on that, in order to grasp instead what I view to be the distinctive feature of his understanding of mathematics throughout his career, which is his commitment to thinking mathematics as a form of process. Okay, and one of the reasons that I'm interested in mathematics is obviously because that's the, I mean, as you put it, Professor Borda, the mathesis as the structure of media that we can master without understanding. I mean, I'm very interested in this idea. I'm also interested in mathematics because mathematics has become something that cultural theorists and philosophers have become very interested in recently, and in my opinion, in ways that go in directions that are misleading. And I'm thinking here of the French philosopher Alain Badiou, who's mobilized the edifice of set theory in order to ground a kind of philosophy of the event as a break from the set, and he has a very complicated argument that draws on some mathematical work in axiomatization that proves that there is no totalizable set, right? And then his student, another French philosopher named Quentin Meillassoux, who I'll be referring to later, who has taken Badiou's argument in order to make a claim that the only absolute necessity is absolute contingency, and that the world could change in massive ways from one moment to the next. And I find both of these arguments dangerous and wrong. So I want to, but I don't want to say it's because they use math or anything like that. It's because they use math in a way that's completely formalistic, that decouples mathematics from history and from experience. So my effort is, the general effort of this project, of which I'm giving you a particular piece of here, is to try to articulate a different way of using mathematics that continues, or that emphasizes the conjunction of mathematics and experience, right? And this is why Whitehead's understanding of mathematics as process, right, is fundamental for me. So Whitehead expresses this commitment to thinking mathematics as a form of process, or as form of process, a commitment which perfectly captures the specificity of his brand of speculation when he writes in his late text from the 30s, Modes of Thought, that, quote, mathematics is concerned with certain forms of process issuing into forms which are components for further process. This statement perfectly expresses Whitehead's effort to round out the picture presented by Plato's conception of mathematics as a changeless world of form. In Modes of Thought, Whitehead's aim is to rethink mathematics through what he considers to be the other and equally necessary side of Plato's philosophy, what Whitehead calls his, quote, second doctrine of life and motion. When Plato thought of the realities of action, Whitehead notes, he swayed to the opposite point of view. He called for life and motion to rescue forms from a meaningless void. Forms on the one side, life and motion on the other, these are the essential ingredients of Plato's philosophy, just as they are the essential ingredients of Whitehead's. Nowhere does this double articulation of form and process find more compelling expression than in Whitehead's remarks in response to his fellow philosopher John Dewey's 1936 call for him to abandon the mathematical formal interpretation of first principles in favor of the, quote, genetic functional interpretation. I must decline to make this decision, Whitehead states categorically, and then goes on to explain, and I quote, "The beauty of philosophy is its many facets. Our present problem is the fusion of the two interpretations, the historic process of the world, which requires the genetic functional interpretation, also requires for its understanding some insight into those ultimate principles of existence which express the necessary connections within the flux." This statement gives further insight into the role mathematics plays in Whitehead's reform of Plato. In pursuit of his stated aim to construct an ontology of experience that fuses a generalized algebra and geometry with process, Whitehead specifies both how mathematical principles are constrained by actual processes of existence and how these processes in turn depend on mathematical forms. Forms provide what Whitehead calls, quote, the basic connectives, general patterns according to which, quote, real variables or unspecified accidental factors can be connected. The key point, however, is that these real variables bring a dynamic and processual aspect into play that suffuse the connectives, the mathematical forms, with the accidental. Quote, "But the connection of the accidents is not a mere mathematical formal principle. It is the concrete accidental fact of those accidents as thus connected. This suffusion of the connective by the things connected is the most general expression of the genetic functional character of the universe." In the suffusion of the connective, not only are the static and invariable mathematical formal principles embodied by accidental factors, they are also revealed to be general forms of potentiality for connection. The relation linking forms of connectedness and things connected is, in short, an internal one, where each is impacted by the force of the other in its own proper expression. Section 2. This picture of the mutual imbrication of mathematical formal and processual accident mathematical form and processual accident bears consequentially on Whitehead's approach to the mathematical concept of infinity. On the one hand, this imbrication of form and process, or form and accident, designates precisely what differentiates modern from Greek mathematics. Thus, what was once a, quote, science of a static universe has been fundamentally reconceived as forms of transition. And I quote from Whitehead again, "The modern concept of an infinite series is the concept of a form of transition, namely the character of the series as a whole is such a form. The notion of the sum of such a series is the notion of a final issue indicated by this form of transition." Here, far from being a purely formal concept, as it is in the 19th century developments preceding and informing the Principia Mathematica, and as it continues to be for contemporary philosophers like those I mentioned, Alain Badiou and Quentin Meillassoux, infinity is a form of process internally related to concrete matter of fact. In this sense, one could say that there is no infinite as such, but only different infinitudes internally related to different finite perspectives. We might say that Whitehead maps the mathematical infinite onto an infinitude of extension, recasting it as the over-fullness of potentiality associated with any given moment, any particular matter of fact in the ongoing development of the universe. Whitehead thereby provides a thoroughly relational conception of the infinite. Such a remapping of the infinite onto extension comprises nothing less than the pinnacle of Whitehead's engagement with mathematics in modes of thought. And I quote again, "We require to understand how the mere existence of unchanging forms requires its own immersion in the creation of a changing historic world. There is a form of creation. We require to understand how infinitude requires the finite. We require to understand how each immediately present existence requires its past, antecedent to itself, and requires its future, an essential factor in its own existence. In this way, immediacy of finite existence refuses to be deprived of that infinitude of extension, which is its perspective." If the infinite is, like any other mathematical form of process, necessarily suffused by the accidentality of what it connects specifically is the superjective force of a given matter of fact. Its relevance, quote, its relevance to potentialities beyond its own actuality of realization. Right? And so Whitehead has this idea of the subject as subject superject, meaning that every part of process, what he calls an actual entity, has a subjective side which concerns its own genesis, right? The way that it reacts to something, to the entirety of the settled world when it comes into existence and creates itself as a subjective unity. But then it has a subjective force, which is its power to influence future actual entities, future moments of process, right? And I, in my work on Whitehead in general and in this work as well, put a lot of weight on this role of the superject and the superjective force of process. So it could also be understood, as I try to understand it, as a kind of force of the environment or an environmental force of subjectivity rather than a subjective or a subject to substance force of subjectivity. So let's see, where was I? Yes. If the infinite is, I'm going to reread the last sentence. If the infinite is, like any other mathematical form of process, necessarily suffused by the accidentality of what it connects specifically is the superjective force of a given matter of fact, quote, its relevance to potentialities beyond its own actuality of realization. Let us call this concept of infinity Whitehead's good infinity. It is the set, if you will, of all potential relations of a given matter of fact. And let us contrast this good infinite with the purely formal concept of infinity, what we can henceforth call Whitehead's bad infinity. Such a concept can be defined by its purported independence from any finite perspective, which is equally to say, by its pure formality. Nowhere does Whitehead condemn such a concept more forcefully than in his very late essay entitled Mathematics and the Good, where he writes, and I quote, "We cannot understand the flux which constitutes our human experience unless we realize that it is raised above the futility of infinitude by various successive types of modes of emphasis which generate the active energy of a finite assemblage. The superstitious awe of infinitude has been the bane of philosophy. The infinite has no properties. All value has the gift of finitude, which is the necessary condition for activity. Also, activity means the origination of patterns of assemblage, and mathematics is the study of pattern. Here we find the essential clue which relates mathematics to the study of the good and the study of the bad." In my talk, I shall try to mobilize this distinction between different infinities and the crucial insight that all pattern in the universe is generated through process to develop a media technical, what I'm calling a media technical account of mathematics. For my purposes, the key point to bear in mind is the following. At the same time as it is mathematics' special vocation to describe pattern, the activity of such description is itself part of process. Put bluntly, mathematical patterns are generated by way of the very same finitizing realities of action that give life to every other mode of process. Taking this Whiteheadian insight as inspiration, I shall try to weave together three separate arguments. First, an argument about mathematics that contrasts the process-compatible operation of abstraction with the formal method of axiomatization. Second, an argument about how mathematics as form of process supports and indeed recapitulates Whitehead's beautiful idea that every actuality prehends the totality of the settled universe. And third, an argument about financial derivatives that understands their claim on the future, the immediate future, as an expression of concrete as opposed to absolute contingency. Section 3. By mobilizing Whitehead's process understanding of mathematics, my aim is to open up a different approach to the infinite from what is at issue in the philosophy of Badiou and Meillassoux, as I've already said. Rather than focusing on the impossibility to totalize that results as a purely formal entailment from the Zermelo-Fraenkel axiomatization of Cantor's set theory, I want, with Whitehead, to mobilize the infinite as a resource within existence, within the domain of existence. What results is a speculative phenomenology that, in concert with the, quote, objective phenomenology that Badiou describes in Logic of Worlds, seeks to bridge the gap between the two main traditions in 20th century continental and particularly French philosophy, namely the phenomenology of the subject on the one hand and scientific epistemology on the other. Like Badiou, Whitehead repudiates the phenomenological reduction and the autonomy of consciousness thereby produced. And like Badiou, he does so in order to free the phenomenon from its dependence on the subject. Yet, whereas Badiou's reinvestment of phenomenology subordinates subjectivity to logic, Whitehead's philosophy of organism generalizes subjectivity in a way that infuses it into every element of process. For Whitehead, that is, consciousness is neutralized in favor of the worldly or superjectal subjectivity of the actualities that make up all experiential entities, or what he calls societies. If consciousness has subjectivity on Whitehead's account, it is not because of some privileged position it holds in relation to the world, right, as a subject in relation to an object, but rather because of its genesis as a composition of worldly actualities, right, and a genesis that is not different in kind from the genesis of any other kind of entity in the world. As a consequence, a speculative phenomenology must not only integrate consciousness into a broader account of subjectivity, but must focus first and foremost on the subjectivity of process independently of any figure of the subject, including consciousness itself. To the extent that it participates in such a speculative phenomenology, mathematics does not furnish a sieve of formalization, as Badiou would have it, and that's a quote, whereby description can be purified of subjectivity. Quite to the contrary, mathematics is itself a mode of subjectivity, and one that is particularly adept at capturing the potentiality of process at any given moment in its ongoingness. As the expression of forms of process, mathematics captures the subjective power of the superject, which, as we shall see, means both the power of past actualities to impact new ones in the present and the power of present actualities to impact the future. Right? So essentially, mathematics gives a way of describing subjectivity that doesn't channel it through what we know from the philosophical heritage of the West as the subject. Section 4. In a recent critique of the contemporary resurgence of realism, and he means speculative realism, media theorist and my friend Alexander Galloway postulates a formal homology between the fundamental operations of set theory and those of the computer programming languages that for Galloway inform the contemporary capitalist mode of production. According to Galloway, Badiou's philosophical appropriation of set theory, quote, shares much more with software and algorithmic systems than he might realize. An uncanny homology exists between key elements in Badiou's ontology, influenced directly by set theory, and key concepts in the design of object-oriented computer languages. To substantiate this claim, Galloway singles out two key set theoretical operations, belonging and inclusion, and likens them to the relations of membership and inheritance central to the object-oriented computer language Java. It is no exaggeration to claim that belonging and inclusion form the elementary concepts of set theory. Indeed, it is on their basis that all of the paradoxes of infinities of different magnitudes can be generated. Belonging defines a fundamental binary operation whereby an object is an element of a set. Okay, so that one. Inclusion defines a derived binary operation whereby one set is a subset of another set. So this one, inclusion. In Badiou's hands, these two fundamental operations define the two possible relations between multiples, where multiples are simply what there is in the world, or ontology. Set theory, this is a quote from Badiou, set theory distinguishes two possible relations between multiples, writes Badiou in Being an Event. There is the ordinary relation, belonging, which indicates that a multiple is counted as an element in the presentation of another multiple. But there is also the relation of inclusion, which indicates that a multiple is a submultiple of another multiple. For Galloway, these basic operations of set theory are reproduced within object-oriented programming languages insofar as these latter create objects through operations of class and inheritance. Class membership refers to a data structure that composes an object. Objects are made up of various forms of data, including variables, methods or functions, and other declarations. And inheritance provides a second way in which an object can acquire members. In this case, classes are extended to other classes, meaning that they inherit all or some of the qualities of that class that they're extended to. Galloway's conclusion is that set theory and object-oriented programming are structurally homologous. Right, and that's what he says right there. Notwithstanding its superficial appeal, this assertion of homology entirely overlooks Badiou's philosophical intervention in set theory, and in my opinion is insufficient for that reason. For Badiou, as we know, set theory, or the theory of multiples, is a static and negative concept that simply designates what there is in the world, right? Multiples. Set theory is Badiou's name for ontology. Badiou's philosophical intervention into ontology exploits the paradoxes that are generated by the interrelation of the two fundamental operations of set theory, belonging and inclusion, in order to assert the non-totalizability of set theory. And very schematically here, the argument runs like this. Because for sets larger than Aleph null, which is the smallest infinite set, the distinction between inclusion and belonging guarantees that every set will generate an infinite power set, or set composed of every subset of its elements. What results is a paradox, namely that every infinite set, by the power set axiom, can compose from its own elements a larger infinite set. For Badiou's purposes, this paradox yields the crucial result that there is no absolute infinite number, or more precisely, that set theory cannot be totalized. For my purposes, and here in contrast to Galloway, what is crucial is how Badiou's deployment of belonging and inclusion differs from their operation in object-oriented programming. If, in Badiou's work, belonging and inclusion serve to underscore the static nature of sets and to introduce paradoxes of transfinite numbers, in object-oriented programming, class and inheritance function to generate objects via dynamic dispatch, a kind of self-rendering as instantiation of an abstract class of variables, methods, and declarations. Far from being conflictual, like they are in Badiou's handling, class and membership are mutually reinforcing. Indeed, inheritance can be thought of as a functional derivative of membership, a way in which a class can be extended to define a more specific object. For example, the operation that yields a class defined as red apple from an extension of a superclass apple simply extends the qualities of the superclass to the new, more delimited class. There is no conflict involved here, and indeed it would be entirely cogent to view inheritance as an extension of membership, a specification of one and the same general operation through which members are entered into a class. What this difference points to is a broader distinction that lies at the heart of my aim here, namely the distinction between pure mathematics on the one hand and computation on the other, between formalization on the one hand and what I would call, with a nod to anthropologist Edwin Hutchins, mathematics in the wild. To the extent that Galloway's true interest in math qua software or algorithm operating as historical actor in the era of computerized capitalism, to the extent that Galloway's true interest is math as software or algorithm operating as a historical actor in the era of computerized capitalism, and to the extent that his true antagonist turns out not to be Badiou himself, but Quentin Meillassoux' anti-historical extension of Badiou's set theoretical formalism, we might do well to invoke an alternate appropriation of set theory in our effort to comprehend its quote, intrinsic link to computation. Section 5. In his account of Georg Cantor's Mengenlehre, Mengen is a multiple, right? The Mengenlehre, the theory of multiples. In Passage des Digitalen, German media theorist Bernhard Siegert discovers a media technical transformation of the paradoxical structure of infinity itself. And this is a quote from Siegert. Mathematically expressed, the solution to the problem is based on the countability of series of even and uneven numbers, and media technically expressed on the availability of an arbitrarily large solution in an actual infinite. Cantor's decimal fractions no longer denumber the real in an analog way. They no longer represent any magnitude. The positions following the comma no longer represent tenths, hundredths, thousandths, etc. They are, independently of any representation of magnitude, simply positions on a list on which one can store data. This means that these Cantor numbers do not converge. Cantor's concept of number no longer conceives number as Stevenian magnitude, but rather as data format, as list. The space in which is mapped the monster functions of arithmetizing programs and a fortiori the mapping of the Mengenlehre is the space that would later be called computer space. What Siegert is describing here is nothing less than a practical Aufhebung of the Mengenlehre and of the problem of multiple infinities that, as we are at least all vaguely aware, led to the development of the digital computer. The prehistory of digital computation from Cantor to Alan Turing is marked by the development of media technical operations for treating infinite magnitudes as finite algorithmic processes. Within this context, and this is the key point that I want to stress here, the mathematics of infinity does not matter because of its potential to generate formal paradoxes, but rather because of its historically achieved role as the concrete ground for experimenting with the limits of what is computable and defining a differentiation or a cut between the computable and the non-computable. Turing's demonstration that David Hilbert's Entscheidungsproblem is undecidable, to give one by no means arbitrary example, transforms Cantor's diagonal method into a practical process for finding an algorithm to determine for a given natural number whether it belongs to the set D of natural numbers. Whereas the diagonal method was originally introduced to map the natural numbers onto the real numbers and to generate ever more transfinite cardinal numbers, its practical repurposing focuses on media technical operations whose aim is to determine whether a specific logical problem is algorithmically solvable, which is to say, computable. Indeed, viewed in the context of Badiou's opposition of belonging and inclusion, the diagonal method can be seen to be marked from the very beginning by a distinct practical tendency. To the extent that the method involves labeling as a way of setting up one-to-one matching between sets and members, it is perfectly general in the sense that it doesn't matter whether one begins with a finite set or an infinite set. In other words, although the method exploits the non-identity of sets of members, inclusion, and members of sets, belonging, which is to say the possibility to generate ever more sets from the different arrangement of members of a set, it does so precisely and exclusively to generate a concrete result. Whether the sets at issue are totalizable simply does not enter the picture. Let us substitute this contrast between formalization and practical application for Galloway's distinction between a realist and a materialist position concerning the relation of mathematics and ontic history. By doing so, we can avoid endorsing Galloway's rather dubious claims concerning the formal identity of set theoretical logic and computational capitalism, and can say something far more specific and less grandiose than what he says about the link between math and capitalism, namely that, quote, mathematization exists today at the heart of the mode of production and therefore not only drives history, but in some basic way is history itself. For if mathematization is deeply involved in history, and I concur with Galloway on this point, it is not simply because computational capitalism deploys the logical and mathematical principles bequeathed to us by the legacy of set theory, but rather for the far more precise and material reason that capitalism is built on the practical, which is to say media technical transformation of concrete set theoretical relations, on the transformation of formal mathematics into computable and executable algorithms. Section 6. Let me now turn to one specific algorithm which, there can be no doubt, has had a marked impact on the recent history of capitalism and of global capitalist culture. The algorithm I have in mind is the Black-Scholes model for pricing derivatives, also known as the Black-Scholes-Merton model for pricing derivatives. Introduced in 1973, Black-Scholes was the first strictly quantitative formula for calculating the prices of options, where the determinative variable is not the change in price, but simply the volatility of the underlying assets. More simply put, the Black-Scholes formula made it possible to base price on the amount of risk associated with the circulation of the underlying, independently of any assessment of its positive value. In their study, Financial Derivatives and the Globalization of Risk, Edward Lipuma and Benjamin Lee link modern derivatives to the rise of speculative capital, which they claim, quote, is currently restructuring the relationship between production and circulation by accelerating and expanding the spatial reach of the reproduction of capital. For Lipuma and Lee, derivatives are emblematic of a qualitative shift in capital, from a system anchored in commodities and production to one that untethers the underlying from anything material, and indeed that derives value from the circulation of money itself. What they call the culture of financial circulation marks a new phase of capitalism where derivatives allow profit to be realized through the exploitation of global connectivity. In their effort to critically evaluate this new system of circulatory capital, Lipuma and Lee focus on the way that financial actors invest in a narrowly scientific approach to derivatives that serves to isolate their circulation from social factors of all sorts. They call this process objectification, and as the name indicates, it involves the reductive transformation of complex and dynamic social, economic, and political relations into static objects, like the derivatives contract, that, they specify, quote, then appears to be independent of these social relations because they are not a part of the manifest appearance of the object or instrument. Objectification finds an ideal instrument in the Black-Scholes formula. As a purely quantitative model for pricing risk, the Black-Scholes formula distills this process of objectification into a medium that can be wielded by traders with little understanding of the mathematics involved. As science and technology studies scholar Donald McKenzie argues, the media technical materialization of risk evaluation in the form of computationally generated data sheets, initially those sold by Fisher Black himself, serves to operationalize the divide between trading activity and the underlying mathematical knowledge on which it is based. In other words, the traders buy and sell derivative products literally with no clue of the mathematics on which pricing is based. If the privileged material support for such mediation was paper, what was actually being mediated was nothing other than the gap between mathematical formalization and the concrete activity of trading that Lipuma and Lee stress, the gap that is, in their account of the efficacy of the Black-Scholes formula. In this sense, the fact that traders became increasingly reliant on computationally generated data sheets helps to explain not just why the Black-Scholes formula literally shaped the emerging derivatives market, but also why the reductive abstractions involved in the formula were effectively beyond interrogation, right? So it's an example of mathesis, of mastery of the media without any understanding of how it works, right? And this is, I couldn't find actually one of the sheets sold by Fisher Black, but this is the kind of data that would be on these sheets that traders were carrying around before computational trading became the norm on the floor in order to make decisions, right? And the idea is that, you know, they're quants who are making these things, and the traders themselves don't understand the logic here, right? So this is a media technical mediation of that knowledge, right? That, you know, led to some bad stuff. Section 7. These abstractions did, however, come into sharp focus following the market crash of October 19, 1987. The exemplar of what trader and popular financial author Nassim Taleb calls a black swan event. This crash marked the occurrence of something that was so unlikely it simply cannot be grasped on the probabilistic model of Black-Scholes. Right, and so the way that Taleb and Lipuma and Lee and others explain this has to do with the massive reliance that traders had on this formalization, right, that then became insufficient to deal with something as unpredictable as the market crash, but was terrible, you know, precisely because everybody was relying on it, right, because it had become such a ubiquitous technical mediation of financial knowledge. The break from log normality following the crash marks the introduction of what is called a volatility smile, a pattern of option pricing in which the graph of implied volatility against strike price is no longer a flat line. That this volatility smile has permanently altered the operation of the market draws attention to the untenability of one of the founding assumptions of the Black-Scholes formula, namely the idea that the volatility of an underlying asset remains constant despite trading activity, or more abstractly, that future prices will reflect past prices, right, which is the basis for the probabilistic model that Taleb and then the other person I'm going to talk about in a minute, Eli Aosh, reject. What lies behind the volatility smile and what comprises the true reason for the failure of the Black-Scholes formula is the futurity of options pricing. What is being speculated on in the present is something that has not yet happened, the fixing of the price in the future. Mackenzie grasps this perfectly when he writes that, quote, the key difficulty in judging the fit between model and market is the need to input an estimate of volatility before the model yields an option price. What is at issue is not past volatility, which can be measured statistically, but future volatility, which cannot. The assumption that volatility is constant, the key requirement for the Black-Scholes formula, perfectly exemplifies the process of objectification as it has been theorized by Lipuma and Lee. It involves creating concrete relations, the actual and constantly evolving relations between prices, as a static object, the statistical measure of volatility of a specific underlying asset. When this objectification breaks down, what is revealed to be untenable is the very notion that future prices can be measured through statistical probability, or that future prices can be modeled on past prices. For Nassim Taleb and in his wake Eli Aosh, this situation signals nothing less than the end of probability. Both ex-traders turned writer philosophers, Taleb and Aosh, consider black swan events to be indications of the illusory nature of probability, as events that cannot be envisioned from within any statistically generated framework, that are not even conceivable from the perspective of the present. Black swan events mark a radical caesura in probability itself. In a collection of papers written over the last decade, and more systematically in his 2010 book entitled The Blank Swan, right, so not the black swan, but The Blank Swan, The End of Probability, Aosh accepts Taleb's claim about black swans. He takes it to mark the end of probability, and he seeks to develop a model of derivative pricing that eschews the methods of probability, i.e. statistical analysis of past prices, in favor of an on-the-fly analysis of current moment-to-moment pricing that, as he puts it, gives us numerical access to the future, the very near future. Aosh's main argument is that the market should replace probability as the metaphysical ground for derivative pricing. If the volatility smile marks the shipwreck of the Black-Scholes formula, a different mode of estimating volatility is called for and is provided by the market itself. Rather than a single number inferred from the history of previous prices that would hold for all derivatives written on a given underlying, what the market produces at any given synchronic moment is a host of volatility numbers correlated with different options that produce a surface of volatility. By taking the prices of these divergent options as the input, forecasts of volatility in the just-to-come future can be generated. For Aosh, the market is the place where price gets determined from moment to moment, and in this sense is the place where all of the material factors that determine price are brought together and expressed. According to Aosh, this means that the market is sensitive not just to the host of factors that most immediately impact the price of a derivative, but ultimately, quote, to the whole human economy, society, and the whole future, a point to which I shall return. For the moment, the key issue is this, that when a trader interacts with prices in the market, he is not dealing with abstractions like the probabilities that describe volatility on the Black-Scholes formula, but with actual material events, and indeed with events that distill, or as Whitehead would say, that prehend the entirety of the world's causal efficacy at that moment. Despite Aosh's claims to dispense entirely with probability, however, His approach, in my opinion, still involves using probability algorithms, but using them, as it were, non-statistically. These get harder and harder, by the way. In his analysis and in the software marketed by his company, ITO33, probability tools are deployed in reverse in order to generate a, quote, forward equation for pricing that is based on the input of actual prices of derivatives in the current instant of the market. And I've got here, it says, for reasons of time, I have to skip the detailed analysis of how this works, but refer you to this quotation. It is confusing and complicated. The conclusion of Aosh's analysis is that because this latter equation results from taking actual material prices as inputs, it is strictly speaking not probabilistic, but rather might be said to stand in for or to function in the place of statistical analysis. If prices at a given moment are an indicator of future volatility and hence of price trends, the reason is that they impose themselves materially, though to be sure partially, on pricing in the just-to-come future. Right? So it's not because of a probabilistic analysis based on past prices, but because of some material force of the pricing in the present moment of the market as it exerts a constraint on the future, right? Or exerts power on the future, we could say. The result of this reverse deployment of probabilistic tools is the positioning of derivatives as what Aosh calls a material technology that provides numerical access to the just-to-come future. Aosh's ultimate target is the metaphysical dream that objective probability can be elevated to the status of law of nature. It is precisely to debunk the metaphysical pretensions of probability that he wrote his book, The Blank Swan, presented as a theory of writing, where writing, i.e. the writing of contingent claims, is understood as an activity that happens in the blank space of the instant market, or the market instant. Aosh's argument mines the resources of Meillassoux speculative thought in order to characterize price as absolutely contingent and the market as a medium of absolute contingency. And if I had more time, I would develop the difference between Aosh's understanding of absolute contingency and Meillassoux, because Aosh's is conditioned by the causal efficacy of the world at that moment, whereas Meillassoux is a purely formalist one that insists that the world could change completely from one moment to the next. So in a way, I'm arguing that, not that you care, right, but that Aosh gets Meillassoux wrong, right, that he misunderstands. He thinks he's thinking the same thing. He thinks something different. And actually what Aosh thinks is much more interesting, right, for my purposes at least. Section 8. The crux of this appropriation, and here again I summarize a longer analysis, centers on Aosh's claim to furnish what Meillassoux hesitates to provide, a derivation of the non-totalizability of the possible, not as a purely formal condition that follows from the principle of factuality, which is how Meillassoux does it, or we could say a formal principle that follows from the axiomatization of set theory, but rather as a materially consequential ground. What this means concretely in the case of derivatives is that the trader or market maker must trade the derivative, which is initially nothing other than a formalization of a possibility, that is, an object of divergent probabilistic reckonings. He must trade that as a contingent claim. Encountering a totalization of possibility, the trader must trade the derivative, quote, at variance with its theoretical value, which is to say, outside this totalized space of the possible, in order to produce an event, the contingent stipulation of price. Untotalization here becomes a concrete correlate of the event of trading. And with this transformation, mathematics itself, the paradigm of pure ahistorical description for Meillassoux, becomes a media-technical tool for producing the contingent event on this side of being. Right? And that's a reference to Badiou, who says that the event is on the other side of being because being is the multiple and blah, whatever. By way of his transformative appropriation of Meillassoux speculative thought, Aosh furnishes an opportunity for us to contrast two logics of the future that are correlated with two fundamentally opposed views of mathematics. At one extreme is Meillassoux' view of absolute contingency and his corresponding understanding of mathematics as the formal description of the pure possible, the pure thinkable. On this view, the future is absolutely unconditioned, and what we commonly understand as laws of nature could simply change at any point. So gravity could stop holding, whatever. At the other extreme is Whitehead's conception of real potentiality and the superjective force of settled fact, with its corresponding view of mathematics as form of process. On this view, the future partially imposes itself on the present, yet remains contingent in a material sense insofar as it can only be produced by the accident of action, which is to say, through the creativity of new actualities that prehend the entirety of the settled world at that moment of its ongoing creativity. And I should rather say the present imposes itself on the future. With its emphasis on the materiality of price and its embrace of the media-technical basis of mathematization, Aosh's account of the market thus furnishes a micro-instance of Whitehead's double-articulated concept of process as form and accident. When Aosh's trader stipulates a price, his activity does not follow from the totality of probabilistic reckonings of possible implied volatility numbers, but rather in spite of them, that is, from the market's sensitivity to the whole human economy, society, and the whole future. At the moment of trading, a vast relational infinitude funnels into the finite perspective of the trader, impacting it in myriad ways, most of which remain beyond the grasp of statistical algorithms, including those operative in human awareness. In Whitehead's philosophy, this funneling of the relational infinite into a finite perspective goes by a technical name. Prehension is the activity whereby an actual entity in its phase of attainment grasps the entirety of the settled world that informs its genesis. From Whitehead's perspective, the claim that prices, quote, reflect knowledge of the market and that they give us a numerical access to the just-to-come future simply means that they prehend the totality of factors affecting the market at a given moment, from the prices of various options on the same underlying to very broad trends in the world at large. Section 9. In modes of thought, Whitehead specifically correlates the finite perspective of actuality with the infinitude of relations that informs its activity. Each fully realized fact has an infinitude of relations in the historical world. This is a quote, sorry. Each fully realized fact has an infinitude of relations in the historical world and in the realm of form, namely its perspective of the universe. We can only conceive it with respect to a minute selection of these relations. These relations, thus abstracted, require for their full understanding the infinitude from which we abstract. Whitehead makes clear that this infinitude of relations encompasses both the settled universe of fact and the potential forms it could take and could have taken, both antecedent pulsations of actuality and, quote, the variety of forms harbored in the nature of things, either as realized form or as potentialities for realization. For this reason, the, quote, data for any one pulsation of actuality consist of the full content of the antecedent universe as it exists in relevance to that pulsation. The data for every pulsation thus consists in, quote, what has been, what might have been, and what may be. In these passages from Whitehead, we get a clear picture of how the process of actuality is informed both by fact and by potentiality. Indeed, recalling the eighth category from Process and Reality, the category of subjective intensity, we can see how two descriptions of potentiality as superjective power and potentiality as mathematical form, converge in Whitehead's relational concept of infinity. The category of subjective intensity states that the subjective aim animating a new actuality is, quote, at intensity of feeling in the immediate subject and in the relevant future. Noting that this double aim is less divided than appears on the surface, Whitehead emphasizes how the future is, in some undeniable sense, already acting within the present. And I quote, "The relevant future consists of those elements in the anticipated future which are felt with effective intensity by the present subject by reason of the real potentiality for them to be derived from itself." For my purposes, the important point is to understand how this structure of futurity, rooted in the real potentiality of actual data, converges with the notion of mathematical form as relational infinitude, as infinitude correlated with a finite perspective. If the future can be felt within the present, that is precisely because the present imposes itself on the future. Yet it imposes its causal force not at the level of events, but at the level of worldly vibrations, which is to say, at the level of molecular processes that only subsequently distill into macroscopic events. If Whitehead's account of prehension as the grasping of totality of a relational infinitude provides a basis for understanding why the actual price of derivatives comprises an index of volatility in the just-to-come future, that is because it furnishes a mechanism for understanding how the universe evolves from moment to moment through incremental or molecular reproduction, where the present is always already a partial imposition on the future. In this sense, Whitehead's account of prehension as the grasping of totality or relational infinitude differs categorically from all forms of probabilistic modeling and also from Badiou's and Meillassoux' non-totalizable infinite, both of which are rooted in a purely formal concept of the infinite. In contrast to these ultimately vacuous figurings of the infinite, Whitehead's account is able to capture situations where the future is materially implicated in the present, but in a mode that is beyond or outside of what is computable. As Whitehead puts it, it is the, quote, vague totality of experience that is original. And because this vague totality is made fallacious by the interpretive reactions we have to it, by the reactions that yield what we call sense perception, it can only be felt in a mode that does not so much clarify as simply capture or express an echo of its sense. If Aosh's market can be called a medium, it is because it perfectly exemplifies Whitehead's notion of vague totality. One comes to the market, as Aosh repeatedly emphasizes, not when one has knowledge, but when one does not know anything. And one trades in the market only at the moment when one exceeds the formalized space of possibility produced by probabilistic algorithms. If traders are market makers, as Aosh claims repeatedly, that is precisely because they can intuit prices' future trending. More precisely still, traders become market makers, according to Aosh, precisely because they can only, quote, feel what is going to happen, because and to the extent that they can see the color of the future. Thank you.